plastics.
Here's a quote from an essay by Marc Andreessen called The Techno-Optimist Manifesto, published on the Andreessen-Horowitz blog this past October. Quote, "Energy is life. We take it for granted, but without it, we have darkness, starvation, and pain. With it, we have light, safety, and warmth. We believe energy should be in an upward spiral. Energy is the foundational engine of our civilization. The more energy we have, the more people we can have, and the better everyone's lives can be. We should raise everyone to the energy consumption level we have, then increase our energy 1,000 times, then raise everyone else's energy 1,000 times as well." End quote. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, specifically episode 2, in which I described the energy-intensive snow removal operation in Montreal, the city I live in, I believe that our relationship to the energy we produce and consume, and specifically the degree to which we require and make good use of that energy, is a topic that deserves discussion outside the confines of the typical talking points, which tend to debate the environmental impact of our use of energy and strategize on new ways to produce more of it, more efficiently, in order to feed the technologies and systems we assume have positive impact on our lives, without ever pausing to reflect on the systemic effects of our having access to such energy, and whether such positive impact really exists. I wasn't sure when the right moment was going to arrive to dive into this subject, but having recently read this article, it's hard not to see it as a sign. It is the perfect prompt, because in one short paragraph, it manages to lay out the pseudo-religious belief system underlying much of the modern way of thinking, which is responsible for societal problems that are increasingly undermining our quality of life. It's bizarre to me that amongst a group of people that are notoriously fanatic about their commitment to using data and logic to inform decisions rather than intuition and gut sense, there does not seem to be even the slightest awareness that the claims being made here, that less energy equals darkness, starvation, and pain, and that more energy and more people should obviously equal better lives for all involve logical leaps that have no basis in data or fact at all. They are, just like the types of decision-making people like Marc would claim to disavow, rooted in nothing more than a gut instinct. More equals better. Faster equals better. Brighter, better. Without limit, to infinity. Do we believe that? What exactly does better mean here? Can energy be used to alleviate suffering and raise quality of life? Absolutely. There can be no denying that in today's world, abundant energy can be transformed into things like food and clean water and shelter, the essentials of a life free of suffering and pain. But it's also important to make a distinction here. Though the definition of a good life is not fixed, it probably wouldn't be controversial, at least among Western humanists, to say that it has at least something to do with some combination of freedom from chronic suffering, and note here that this is distinct from acute or temporary suffering, which counterintuitively can actually be a good thing, as well as opportunities for moments of happiness and joy, and a foundation and a broader sense of fulfillment, purpose, meaning. These things together are, to my mind, and I'd be curious to know if anyone disagrees with this, what form the basis of a good life. And if we're working with such a definition, then the ways in which we can be effective in using energy to improve lives are far from unconstrained. Pain is one of the places it works best because pain is not relative. If someone is constantly in pain, he does not simply get used to the pain and have that become his new neutral state. Instead, he lives in perpetual pain. It's always there in the background, eating away at their quality of life. A fact to which many a grumpy old man can attest. And the upshot is that alleviating such pain is a reliable and predictable way to tangibly improve lives. And this is good news in the context of increasing availability of energy, because there are entire playbooks of simple, well-documented, and broadly applicable ways to keep people out of pain, for which the only barrier to wide-scale distribution is lack of energy. These are things like ensuring access to food and water, shelter, and robust medical care. The only reason any of these are not ubiquitous around the entire world is because of the cost and energy required to produce and distribute them. And that means that the world of abundant energy Marc is pining for clearly solves this problem. That fairly directly translates to a higher quality of life for those affected. As someone who suffers from chronic back pain thanks to a skateboarding-related disc injury when I was younger, I've experienced this firsthand. On the days that my back pain really flares up, everything revolves around it. It subconsciously affects my decision-making process. I get out of bed later because I know both consciously and subconsciously that movement leads to pain. That makes me feel lazy, which makes me feel guilty, which makes me feel grumpy, which in turn affects my relationships and my productivity and just about every aspect of my daily life. I've dealt with this type of pain for over a decade, and though I'm fully aware how it affects me, there are still many days when I simply cannot do anything about it. I can't just override the way it manipulates my psychology, and I can't change the way my mood affects everyone around me. It simply makes me worse off, and there's no question that anything that could alleviate that pain would represent a tangible improvement in my quality of life. So there's that. That's how pain works. But as I mentioned earlier, pain isn't the exclusive determination of a good life. There are other factors as well, and the degree to which energy can improve them is far less clear. Unlike pain, positive emotions, joy, excitement, and pleasure, do not have a neutral state because the neutral state is, by definition, the state of their absence. This means that when we pursue these positive emotions, we are starting from the neutral state and pushing above it. And it also means that there's no point at which we can clearly determine that we've achieved anything, since at least conceptually, there is no limit to how good we could make our lives by continuing to just push higher and higher and higher toward that infinity, and that the harder we push, the better things get. But the reality is that the chemicals in our brains that produce these feelings can only be released in finite quantities, and there's a limit on the amount of those chemicals we can biologically make use of. So there actually is a cap on the amount of pleasure we can experience from them. And what complicates the picture further is that our attempts to circumvent these biological limits, to make our lives better through novelty and increasing scale, can actually have the opposite effect. They shift our baselines, our sense of what normal or neutral is, into greater and greater extremes, making it harder and harder to find the experiences that are exceptional enough to give us the feelings we're chasing. Here's a simple way to think about it. When we find and fix the cause of some suffering, that pain is alleviated forever. But when we encounter something that brings us joy, we don't simply continue to feel that joy endlessly. It fades. And if we try to reclaim that sense of joy by chasing it, by repeating that same action, what we feel the second time around is not the same as the first. It is a diminished version of what we originally felt. There are no 30-year-olds still riding the high of getting their first video game system for Christmas when they were 7. Even the most magical of experiences, wedding days, the births of children, and other such happy experiences, do not leave us in a permanent state of ecstasy. On the contrary, these experiences make us feel elevated precisely because they are so different from what we experience in our daily lives. A high is called a high because it contrasts against and rises above our baseline. And the thing is that from the moment it's achieved, it begins to fade, and chasing after it is impossible, because repeating the experience would simply cause it to become familiar and unexceptional. It becomes the new baseline, which we must now go beyond in order to experience the same feeling. And in this sense, chasing this elevated state becomes something like an arms race against yourself. Think about the first time you did something thrilling, like ride a roller coaster or climb a mountain. If you had a great time, your impulse might have been to go back and do it again, to ride the same roller coaster a couple of times, and then go, man, I'd like to try another one. I'd like to go try different styles of roller coasters and different theme parks. And if riding a roller coaster really did it for you, you might become the type of person who could be called a theme park junkie who travels about seeking the most exceptional of thrills. After a while, what begins to happen is instead of simply pursuing roller coasters, we start pursuing extreme novelty. The theme park in the next city over has coasters that are more or less the same as the ones we're used to. That's an already familiar experience and therefore not a thrill. We now need something bigger, something novel, something that can give us the exceptional enough experience that it triggers the same reward pathways that the very first roller coaster did. We have, in effect, developed a tolerance to roller coasters. At this point, much like the actual junkie who has to take 5 times the amount of the same drug to get the feeling he once did, the feeling we get from seeking the most exceptional roller coaster still might not even compare to the thrill that someone gets who's only ridden a roller coaster once or twice in their entire life. In terms of feeling, the same cocktail of chemicals is released in the brain either way. It's just that in the case of the junkie, the stimuli required to produce it is orders of magnitude larger, which translates not only into a greater expense and commitment of time and effort, but also into a dulling of the sensitivity to the bounty of naturally occurring stimuli in our world that are otherwise capable of sustainably bringing us those same feelings. If instead of chasing after the thrill of the roller coaster, we simply dwell on the memory without pursuing it, Then after a while, our tolerance disappears, and we can once again find joy in it when at some point it might reappear on its own. And though the amount of time that must pass in between those reappearances might seem, particularly in our world of plenty, like an artificial denial which inflicts unnecessary suffering upon us, when we look back on times like those, in which we eagerly awaited some payoff that we knew was in the distance, they rarely feel to us like moments of excruciating suffering, but rather moments of meaningful excitement and palpable anticipation. The magic of Christmas as a child, for example, comes from the fact that it only happens once a year. If we did it any more often than that, the holiday would almost certainly begin to lose its power. Of course, every child wants to open gifts immediately, the moment they appear under the tree. But that doesn't mean that the anticipation that builds up in the lead up to Christmas is anything like suffering that might stand in the way of a child's quality of life. In fact, it's much closer to the opposite. It sets the stage for an almost universal childhood nostalgia. Pleasure, therefore, is unusual in that it often cannot be pursued directly. It's not that it's not an important part of a fulfilling life, it's just that it can't be pursued mechanically in the way that pain reduction can. The more we chase it, the more the things that have the ability to deliver it lose their power. They become depleted as they become familiar, requiring us to scale up our inputs exponentially. And this is what would happen if, in Marc's world in which we've, quote, increased our energy 1,000 times, end quote, we decide to use that newly available energy to chase these types of elevated states. We would simply transform our world into one that requires an order of magnitude more energy to maintain, just to leave us feeling exactly the same as we did had we done almost nothing at all, and with a much longer way to fall should we ever fail to maintain it. So what does this all mean? It means that Marc's idea that increasing our consumption of energy increases our quality of life is only partly true. It's true insofar as we're using it to bring people out of poverty and to alleviate pain and suffering. It's true when we're using energy to produce and distribute equipment and medicines and vaccines and antibiotics that keep people healthy. And it's true when we're using it to make the basic necessities of life, good quality food, clean water, and shelter, universally available. But beyond those things, it means that we begin to suffer the profound consequences of producing all that energy, as well as the less considered consequences of simply having all that energy available, and for little to no additional benefit. I'd like to talk about these consequences, but first, here's a question. Where exactly is the disconnect here? Why is it that people like Marc are so convinced they're doing good for the world? Personally, I'm skeptical there's anything nefarious happening. I think it's much more likely they're just confused. A large portion of the people who subscribe to this idea that abundant energy makes life better for everyone are exactly the same people who are themselves building, designing, and leading the development of the products and processes that consume the energy they believe is so important. And I absolutely believe that when that type of person wakes up in the morning, they really do feel wonderful and have a genuine sense that they're living great lives. But it's not for the reason they think. They think that since their lives are quote-unquote good, and the thing they spend their life on is producing these technologies, that it follows that spreading such technology far and wide and continuing to develop them further and inventing new ones will allow other people to live similarly good lives. But here's the problem. The reason these tech people feel so good about their lives is not because the things they produce, the faster and more convenient and more novel ways of getting places and talking to people and doing things, not because those things make them feel happy or excited, though surely that happens from time to time. I have no doubt that riding a gyroscopically balanced one-wheel scooter is highly entertaining the first couple of times you step onto it. But ultimately, the reason these people don't become unhappy once these things inevitably lose their novelty is because the true driver of their quality of life is not in the products themselves, but in the act of producing these products, of being part of a team, an operation that they truly believe is making the world a better place. They wake up every day and join a flurry of activity larger than themselves. They give themselves to it, and it gives back to them. And this is what gives them a sense of purpose and a sense of accomplishment, and which situates them in the midst of a narrative that answers the questions we all have about why we get up in the morning and what this is all for. They're achieving fulfillment, and it is fulfillment, perhaps more than anything else, that forms the foundation of a life well lived. But there's a massive problem with the path to fulfillment that people like Marc have found, and that is that the very mechanism by which it operates puts us on a path that leads to the explicit destruction of the traditional, accessible, and sustainable mechanisms of fulfillment relied upon by everyone else. everyone who is not a part of the tiny fraction of people at the helm of the tech companies that are increasingly writing our story. And this is where the 1000x energy scenario takes a very dark turn. If we are ever unfulfilled in life, it is not because we haven't yet attained a civilization capable of providing fulfillment to us. It's that we've lost the one we already had. We remove the attributes from the world that serve to facilitate fulfillment. This happens not only because we too often fail to even consider fulfillment as a necessary part of a good life, but also because we seem to be extraordinarily confused about what it is and where it comes from. Anyone who has read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World knows that fulfillment is in short supply in a world designed around superficial pleasure. And though we are familiar with various tropes, if you ask people about fulfillment, they'll probably tell you about causes they support and helping groups of people, protecting animals, ecosystems, volunteering time, money, etc. Though these things are surely familiar to all of us, fulfillment also does not simply manifest as a result of random acts of kindness. A donation to an animal shelter or the purchase of a box of cookies from a Girl Scout is not likely to be particularly fulfilling in and of itself. And that's because fulfillment, unlike everything else we've talked about so far, is not something that can exist in isolation. It can't be commodified, furnished with a purchase or an invention or a subscription, because like the ecosystems I talked about in the previous episode, fulfillment too depends on the existence of a complex ecosystem of interactions between ourselves and other humans and the living world around us. There is no shortcut to developing that type of ecosystem. We cannot simply make it from disposable energy when it's in short supply. And in fact, spending energy more often serves to dismantle it than to make it, because like all ecosystems, it is the result of patterns that emerge over time, and time has no shortcuts. To feel fulfilled, to be fulfilled, we must be embedded in such an ecosystem and achieve a balance between contributing to it and being supported by it. Buying that box of Girl Scout cookies, for example, has almost no meaning in and of itself. But perhaps it's not just any old Girl Scout that shows up at your door, but your neighbor's kid. And you know your neighbor and his family. And you can picture how excited the girl will be to tell her dad about the boxes she sold. And you'd like to facilitate that moment. And perhaps your neighbor also helped you one time to move a piece of furniture or something. And so you also feel thankful for the opportunity to repay the favor. Maybe you yourself had a formative experience with the Scouts as a kid, and you want to support the organization so that others can have what you had. And maybe you're impressed with how responsible your neighbor's daughter seems to have become, and you remember you've been looking for someone to feed your pet while you're out of town. In this case, a once meaningless interaction has been woven into a living ecosystem of interactions, which you, your neighbor, and his child are all members of, which connects past, present, and future. An ecosystem which each person is uniquely capable of contributing to, and which supports them as a result of those contributions. These types of ecosystems of interactions exist naturally in a healthy society, because healthy societies are governed not by complicated designs, but by patterns of complexity. In the natural world, we accept that larger amounts of entropy and biodiversity make an ecosystem more resilient, thanks to a greater potential for emergence, and therefore a greater ability to fill ecological gaps that might be created by a disruption. The human world is very much the same. We comprise an ecosystem of human interaction. The more complex it is, the greater its ability to support us and provide for us. And it's not just a safety net, but an elevating force from which we are able to draw what we need. And when that force is strong, it makes us feel safe and supported and capable and inspired. We feel fulfilled. In a healthy ecosystem, nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing is purely transactional. And even the most mundane things like buying food happen in a way that celebrate complexity. When local markets run by people from the neighborhood stock food produced by local farms and distributed by local businesses, a system emerges that is not governed by codified rules but by relationships. They are porous, filled with opportunities for people to engage and for new connections to form. A farmer who has a tangible connection to his clients does not need a formal definition of organic and the threat of a lawsuit to keep him from cheating on his crops, because there is a shared understanding between him and his customers. He is linked to them and cares what they think of him, and he is driven not only by his relationship to them, but by the fact that they inhabit the same ecosystem, and that the things each of them puts into it affect them as much as anyone else. There is a non-negligible possibility that the farmer might end up sharing a meal with one of his customers at some point, eating from their table the food that he himself grew. And conversely, the customers care about the well-being of the farmer. Instead of judging anonymous produce on the shelf by its aesthetic qualities alone, they connect it to a real place, perhaps a place they've visited, and to real people and their families. And when the produce is not shiny and perfect, when it shows up with a bruise or a bit of dirt on it, or when it's an unexpected size or unusual variety, they might think of the farmer and his farm and remember the unusual weather they'd had that year, or the fact that some federal policy had affected his farming practices, or that it was his first attempt at growing that particular varietal. These connections are everything, because they answer all the existential questions we would otherwise have about why we do the things we do, about why they matter. The farmer who sells to people whose faces he can picture knows why he does what he does, as do the people who buy from him. They both support and are supported by each other, even just in this one little corner of life. And when you take these types of interactions and multiply them by the multitudes of possible human experiences, of all the things people do, and all the possible ways there are to do them, and when you realize that each of these little microcosms themselves interact with all the others, that farmers don't interact just with eaters, but with the machinists who make their equipment, and the brew pubs that host their farm stands, and the neighborhood kids who staff those farm stands, and that those connections themselves fan outward to infinity, it's easy to see that the fundamental answer to the question why is for us. The depth of the complexity of this type of ecosystem grows larger and more profound over time. As time progresses, its interactions develop into a story, often memorialized physically in the form of objects, buildings, and artifacts, past choices made by past members of the same living ecosystem, preserved in history, adding depth and strength to the present, helping us to understand the connections between us. Stories are fuel for these types of ecosystems. This is the essence of fulfillment. To be a member of the enchanted garden of humanity, to scratch a primordial itch, to protect and to support each other. And this is what we're poised to lose in the pursuit of unlimited energy, because it is only in modern history that we have become uniquely capable of so distorting patterns of human interaction that we have begun to remove the possibility of fulfillment from the table entirely. I sense there are two key ways this is happening. The first is by over-systematizing our lives in pursuit of efficiency, and the second is by overindulging our destructive impulses. The former presents the seeds of complexity from being sown, and the latter denies them time to grow. We have, throughout history, been a species that designs systems that change the nature of our relationship to the complex world. We create rule-based societies that govern how we interact with one another. We build cities and towns according to rules that articulate the uses of different types of space, and we create concepts like property. We operate businesses, and we sign contracts. And we do all of this in order to carve out from complexity little zones of predictability in which we can be protected, at least to a degree, from the evils of an unpredictable existence. And to be clear, this is not a bad thing. Without these systems, we would undoubtedly be far more familiar with violence and war and famine, disease. Sharing knowledge would be harder, and it would also, needless to say, be damn near impossible to collaborate productively on anything other than hyperlocal scale, which would essentially take us back to the Stone Age in terms of art and architecture and science and technology. There's no doubt that abandoning our impulse to systematize altogether would be a step backward. But there's a flip side to this coin as well, because though we have always systematized, it has until very recently been kept in check by the hard limit on the amount of energy available to us. It's all well and good to make up a bunch of rules about how people should interact with one another, but it's a whole other thing entirely to actually enforce them. There is a reason that, prior to the modern era, the concept of a country with its well-defined borders did not even exist, and instead there were simply centers of power with overlapping spheres of influence, strongest and most effective at the center and diminishing the farther one moved away from it, and cultures and patterns of behavior that were similarly wishy-washy around the edges. To maintain a well-defined state in which rules apply uniformly and are enforced consistently within its boundaries, from the city centers to the countryside, you need to administrate an enormous operation. At minimum, a transportation system, roads and rail that must be built and maintained for materials that must be sourced, and which are paved according to maps that must be designed based on surveys that must be conducted, and then printed on paper that must be produced. And one must have data about people and where they live and what taxes they've paid and what permits they've been issued. And all of that data must be collected and standardized and distributed and then updated and redistributed in perpetuity. To standardize and systematize on this scale is damn near impossible without energy available in quantities far beyond what humans can muster in manpower alone. There is simply too much to control, too much complexity to be tamed, and that has meant that for most of history, there was a limit to just how large such systems could grow. But as the amount of energy we have at our disposal has rapidly grown over the course of the last century or so, that limit has disappeared, and the consequences of its disappearance are everywhere. Many of them are already discussed in history books. New systems of government like communism, which require a high degree of centralized coordination, waited to make their debut until we had the energy to maintain them, or at least to make a plausible attempt. And though they have since died out, their spirit lives on in the form of today's ever-expanding systematization. In agriculture, for example, we've seen small farms become bigger, and big farms consolidated into national corporations, and big ag corporations gone global. Hydroponic produce uses energy to make giant glass boxes that tame the complexity of the weather, and more energy to run enormous arrays of lamps that tame the complexity of sunlight, and even more energy to produce nutrients that tame the complexity of the decomposition process that normally feeds crops. And if there were ever a perfect illustration of the impact that this has had on the complexity of our societies, it is in the output of these farms over the course of this transition, which has eliminated an entire breadth of seasonally available, locally adapted vegetables in many shapes, sizes, colors, and tastes, in favor of homogeneous organisms that can be integrated into standardized systems designed to accept energy as an input and produce units of vegetable that can be marketed and distributed in standardized plastic packaging without the need for any knowledge of the time or the place or the impact of their production. Another assembly line product embedded so deeply in the world of rules that many vegetables have now even become the subject of patents used to thwart those who might otherwise attempt to resist the forces of systematization by introducing some new varietal. This is a real thing, and if anyone is curious to know about just how much agricultural diversity we've lost, I highly recommend starting with an opinion article Dan Barber, founder of the famous farm-to-table restaurant Blue Hill Farm, wrote in the New York Times a few years back called "Save Our Food, Free the Seed." You can Google it. Systematization is everywhere, and once you've trained your eye to spot it, it's impossible not to notice its rapid expansion. It's not just about the individual industries like food or government. Thanks to technology, and in particular the huge amounts of money to be made by scaling software products across billions of users, we live in the midst of a race to systematize absolutely everything around us, to write software abstractions of the real world that can be used by and sold to as many people as possible. And because that software works in exactly the same way, according to the exact same code, no matter who uses it, it is literally standardizing all of human behavior, turning it from a complex ecosystem of varied interactions into a standardized, complicated, controlled system with a finite number of predetermined outcomes. Rideshare apps, dating apps, food delivery apps, pretty much all apps create predictable experiences from once messy human interactions. Productivity software standardizes the way we work. Cloud software takes it even further because instead of different versions running on different machines, we're all using the same version of the software at the exact same time, all across the world. Especially in the working world, our daily experiences are converging as our thought patterns are increasingly shaped by ubiquitous products, platforms, and systems. There are 8 billion of us here on this planet. People like Marc Andreessen and Jeff Bezos are telling us that that's a good thing, that more is necessarily better. As I mentioned once before on this podcast, Bezos said in a recent interview that he believes that more people means more Mozarts and more Einsteins. That would be great if it was true. But in a world where we all think in exactly the same way, where our brains have been trained on identical tools, not similar tools like typewriters and hammers and accounting strategies, which maintain individuality despite common function, but identical tools that mean all of us globally do our work in Excel and Notion and Salesforce and Slack, that Gmail autocompletes our sentences and Grammarly tells us the quote-unquote best way to phrase them. In a world where the infinite complexity of human perspective is corralled into a handful of clusters that ebb and flow according to the behavior of a handful of social media algorithms, in that world, can we really expect a utopia of human dynamism to emerge? Are we really more creative for our increasing numbers? Or are we, in effect, making ourselves more like bees, a hive of predetermined roles and associated behaviors for whom the value of any individual colony member is 0? Of course, this is only half the story. As I mentioned earlier, there's a second mechanism to the corrosiveness of energy, in its propensity to erase the stories and the history that make complex societies resilient. If we look back through history, most of which spans a period of time in which energy was difficult to come by and was largely derived from some combination of fire, water, and human effort, we, as a civilization, went to great lengths to ensure that energy was never wasted. To do something like construct a building did, and still does, cost an enormous amount of energy. And when that energy was coming directly from human labor, the only way to increase output was to add more people. In contrast to the mechanism being suggested today, that more energy is a means to more people and more people is somehow the thing that is intrinsically better, the old world paradigm was reversed, and therefore much more obviously true. More people meant more energy. And in that world of energy scarcity, more energy really did translate to a better quality of life, in that it enabled us to meet the minimum standards of living we talked about at the beginning of this episode, and to create things of beauty and permanence and meaning. But adding those additional people, especially in pre-modern times, is not something that could simply be done on a whim. The number of humans we had access to was more or less finite, so the only way to use more energy was to commit more time to whatever it was being spent on. A person that can do X amount of work in one day can, of course, do twice that amount of work in 2 days. And it is from this tension between our desires and aspirations and our ability to manifest them only over long periods of time that history and narrative emerge. Without unlimited energy, buildings often did not get built on the order of years, but rather decades or even many lifetimes. This had several consequences. First off, it meant that there was no option other than to build the building in a way that it would last, because if we're talking about a building that could take a lifetime to build, using materials not designed to last a lifetime would undermine the whole project. It also meant that the thing being created had to have meaning beyond just simple utility, because it had to sustain the motivation to finish it throughout the types of changes found in a world that was far less predictable than the one we know today. Today's approximate guarantee that a permit issued grants the right to complete the project would have been much flimsier, if it existed at all, and subject to rapid changes in leadership, government, and societal context. And so an anchor in more fundamental, irrevocable things like beauty, community, and identity was required to preserve momentum. And finally, it meant that an exponentially larger number of people would be involved in any individual project, each of them bringing their unique skills, as well as their strategies and their methods and beliefs. And all of those things would converge on a finished product that was not just the instantiation of a developer's impulse, but a thing of real cultural significance and deep connection from the very moment of its completion. Something with a name, known amongst the community and with stories attached to its history, deepening the complexity that leads to fulfillment. Today, a similar amount of energy goes into creating a building, but it's no longer human energy and therefore does not facilitate connections between people, is not limited in scope, and perhaps most significantly, is unbound by time. The more energy we burn, the shorter the timeline gets, and the less we must plan for the future. This removes the incentive to create things of deep meaning. We exit the realm of complexity and enter that of commodity and standardization. Without an incentive to conserve energy, for example, a building being constructed on an imperfect building site, one that's not completely flat and dry, no longer needs to account for those unique characteristics. Clever solutions that would have asked a structure to accommodate its environment, perhaps by allowing water to flow around or through it, or to flow across uneven landscapes, cantilevered off boulders, connected with bridges, divided into components of fractal size and shape. Those creations that take on the form of their environment are no longer necessary, because the existence of unlimited energy changes the problem statement. It's not a matter of what sort of building would accommodate the environment, because when energy is unlimited, a much simpler and lazier question to answer is, what sort of environment can accommodate our building? Can we remake this environment to accommodate our building? The amount of energy it takes to level a hillside or reroute a body of water can be exponentially more than the amount required to construct a clever building. Without unlimited energy, we're forced to use our brains, to be clever in order to create things that are uniquely appropriate in one specific place and time, onto which stories can be attached that facilitate identity and culture. But for some reason, even though we seem to prefer this kind of thing subconsciously, if the things we choose to visit and talk about and spend money on, especially as tourists, are any indication, it seems that when we're faced with an alternative that allows us to be lazy, to not have to use our brains and invest in a clever solution, we invariably take the shortcut. And that means that at scale, we have stopped building a fulfilling civilization in our environment, and instead, we've opted to erase that environment in order to accommodate a neatly packaged, economically efficient civilization of utility at scale, into which sterile, pre-designed units can be bulk added on a purely utilitarian basis, ultimately producing an artificial world not unlike the sort of habitat we might create for a hamster, a human terrarium, filled with the sorts of things that Marc Andreessen, the late French anthropologist, famously called non-lieux, non-places, fully disconnected from the ecosystem of humanity. This transformation is visible at every scale. It is in the macro, the 5-story, boxy, developer-modern apartment buildings going up in what feels like every city around the world. But it's also in the micro, in the sense that cheap energy has led to a proliferation of standardized and abundantly available materials which enable the formation of trends, the sort that encourage us to remake our homes and our environments over and over again, and to assume that this cycle of wiping out entirely rather than adapting, tearing out the 80s bathroom for the 90s one, then tearing out the 90s one for the 2000s one, forever and ever, is eternal, and therefore no care need ever be taken to make things that won't shortly fall apart or become useless or irrelevant. Things with enough staying power that they might not merely exist for a moment, but remain long enough to absorb history and acquire a patina and become an additional link in the web of complexity through which we connect. When energy is expensive, our creations have value because they cannot simply be replaced. When energy is unlimited, the world becomes disposable, and despite their practical utility, disposable things, storyless things that disappear without a trace, are useless on our path to fulfillment. The Parthenon lasted 2,500 years and counting. How long will the Hudson Yards vessel last? Answer: until we get bored of it, demolish it, and forget it ever existed. I have no doubt, as Marc Andreessen suggested, that a world full of unlimited energy would indeed be full of light, safety, and warmth. I have no doubt that we could live in that world very efficiently. But what about Marc's ultimate suggestion that doing so would make our lives better? Is there room for fulfillment in a matrix-like society that altogether replaces complexity with utility? I'm not so sure. As a final thought, you might be wondering why, if it's possible for people like Marc to find fulfillment in their work, that is, if it's possible for a corporate ecosystem to stand in for the missing societal ecosystem, why can't we all look to our careers to fulfill that function? And I have 2 things to say about that. The first is that it seems to me that for that to be possible requires a degree of autonomy at work that few people have. Sure, if you're close enough to the top of the ladder that you're allowed to make decisions about what you work on and how you engage with the company, without those decisions being subject to scrutiny and inflexible rules and processes, then perhaps the ecosystem of a business to which you've devoted yourself can be fulfilling. But this is not a luxury that most people have. And the second thing is that even when they do, relying on work for fulfillment is dangerous, because no matter how embedded you become, no matter how good your work is and how close you are to your coworkers, the nature of your relationship is fundamentally that you are being paid to be there. And if for whatever reason that fundamental is no longer justifiable, that relationship can simply end on a moment's notice, and in a flash, you're cut off. Though it may resemble a more traditional one, an ecosystem of a business is a walled garden. At any point, you can be chucked over the wall. And if you were the type of person who leaned on that ecosystem for fulfillment, this can literally feel like being stripped of everything: identity, purpose, meaning, all in one fell swoop. Needless to say, the idea of a person's life force being more or less contingent on their job performance isn't a recipe for a healthy society. But at the risk of opening a whole new can of worms, I'm going to leave it there for now. Once again, thank you for listening.